Sorry about the delay. We had some technical issues, but now we're on air and we're joined by Joel Bourne from the United States. Joel is an award winning journalist and a frequent contributor to the National Geographic magazine. He is the former senior editor for the Environment magazine. And to his credit, he's covered the global food crisis of 2008. And most recently, he contributed articles to the National Geographic's groundbreaking 8-part series titled The Future of Food, and which won the prestigious A.H. Burma Award from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Um, Joel's latest book, The End of Plenty, is also the 2016 recipient of the PEN or E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. Joel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kumaar. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here.
Great. Joel, let me jump right in. You've done tremendous amount of work on the global food crisis, agriculture, and what's going to happen in the next 20, 30, 40 years, given the population explosion, given the way agriculture is today and what it's moving towards. Um, Tell me, what is it that's driving you to work on these issues? I mean,
Well, I grew up in a rural part of the United States in southeastern North Carolina. My family had a farm in the county. I was always very interested in agriculture. And even though I studied agriculture in college, I ended up becoming a journalist simply because the economics at the time in the mid-1980s were not favorable for me to go back and farm. So I became a journalist, but I always kept the farm in my heart and agricultural issues in my heart. And as I became an environmental journalist and began writing about climate change, drought, desertification, these sort of things, it made me realize that the biggest environmental issue of my generation will be how we feed our growing population in the midst of climate change over the next 30 to 40 years. It's going to affect everything. It affects water, it affects energy, it affects poverty, it affects even national security as we see what's going on in Syria and in Northern Africa, which is partly food related. So all of these things sort of came together during the global food crisis of 2007, 2008. And that's when the realization hit. And that's when I thought, you know what? People are looking at these very disparate things all around. Nobody's really putting the big picture together and looking at the food crisis as the greatest environmental crisis we've faced in 50 or 60 years.
I mean, we're obviously facing a crisis of overpopulation globally. But you were mentioning some statistics on what the future of global population will look like in terms of them having access to drinking water and food. So tell us a little bit about your research in that area and what do you find extremely striking and worrying?
Sure. Well, around not even 4 or 5 years ago, all the global agricultural experts felt that all we needed to do is feed everybody adequately by 2050. And that's when population was projected to hit about 9 billion people around the world and then start to decline. Well, unfortunately, recent statistics and more recent projections looking at fertility rates around the world, which have not dropped as fast as everyone had hoped, we're now looking at having to feed 9.7 billion people by 2050, increasing to more than 11 billion by the end of the century. Now, this is incredibly problematic when it comes to food supply. That means we're going to have to, even by mid-century, produce almost twice the amount of food as we currently produce, really within the next 35 years. This is an enormous challenge. In the meantime, climate change continues to ratchet up the pressure on food supplies through these extreme events, high temperatures, and drought. So we've seen some incredible experiences of that already. In 2003, Europe had a drought that killed almost 75,000 people and wiped out a third of their grain and fruit crops. 2010, Russia lost a third of its wheat crop to the highest temperature since 1500. And of course, here in the United States, we had back-to-back droughts in 2012 and 2013 that affected almost every agricultural state in the United States, cost us $30 billion. So these things are already underway. Now, what really scared me to death, and which was one of the great impetus for writing this book, is a study that came out by the Royal Society in London a few years ago. And basically, it was a broad metadata look at climate change impacts on food supplies and our ability to produce food for the future. And it found that if we get to 4 degrees Celsius increase, which we're currently on track to produce with our current rate of emissions, half of our agricultural land could be either unsuitable or much less suitable for agriculture than it is now by the end of the century. And that's when we're going to have 4 billion more people, potentially. So feeding half again as many people on half the amount of agricultural land is a frightening scenario. What we're looking at there really is the end of plenty for the vast majority of Earth's people. So we just cannot go there. We have to come up with a better way to produce our food, and also we have to come up with good ways to decrease our demand.
So when we're really discussing, the title of our session today, Hungry, Thirsty, and Crowded, clearly, there are examples now emerging of the extreme amount of wastage happening on all fronts. So whether it's water, drinking water, sanitation, or food. On one hand, you have people dying of hunger and malnutrition, and on the other hand, you've got largesse on all parts of the planet. So where do you see sort of that converging?
Well, that's really interesting. Food waste and water waste is one of the critical issues that we're going to have to solve in order to get everybody reasonably fed. We currently lose about 30% of our food, either pre-farm gate or post-farm gate. Now, in the developed world, it's mostly after we get it to market and we waste it, because we eat too much or we scrape too much away or we don't like the blemished food in the market. In the developing world, it's pre-farm gate. They don't have the refrigeration. They don't have the ability to get their crops to market. They don't have the protections that we have in the developed world. So they lose a lot of their crops before it even gets to market. Now, you mentioned water. Water is incredibly inefficient. We use 70% of our fresh water for agriculture. And the demand for water, according to the United Nations, is supposed to almost double by 2050. And yet the water does not exist to fulfill that demand. Fortunately, we're incredibly wasteful when it comes to our water. Most irrigation is only 50% efficient. That means half the water, including half the energy it takes to move it, is simply wasted. It goes in the sky, it goes below the root zone. It's of absolutely no use. So we have to become more efficient at how we use water. And fortunately, there are a lot of young people who are working on this issue, trying to come up with micro hydro systems that are cheap and extremely efficient, which increases that efficiency above 90%. And I think that's certainly the direction we're going to have to go as water becomes more and more valuable. Currently, almost half the population of the planet experiences water stress at some point during the year. And that's only projected to increase as climate change continues to ratchet up.
And, when we're talking about, water scarcity, I think there are some positive things happening as well. There are newer technologies, newer research and development going on in terms of how can we use seawater for all kinds of purposes, and looking at recycling water as well. Of course, from different kind of areas, not stuff that we don't want to get into our system, but certainly research is going on. And do you think the current trajectory of all these research initiatives will see fruition enough to be able to meet demand?
That's the billion-dollar question right there. Certainly, there's an enormous amount of investment and effort to try to get desalination up and running so that we can tap this vast amount of water that's in the ocean. It takes a lot of energy at the current time. It takes a lot of money. Only countries that are extremely wealthy, like those oil-rich countries in the Middle East, do it on a large scale. Although the costs are coming down as technology improves. Now, the most positive trend, of course, is this recycling program that you mentioned, where we're actually, cleaning water that's not quite salt, but it's not quite fresh either. And one of the great examples we see of that is right in Anaheim, California, south of LA, right outside where the original Disney World, was built. And they're actually recycling an enormous amount of water from their sewage system, which sounds very gross, but it's become extremely popular amongst the local community because they're in the midst of a 4 or 5 year drought right now. And water scarcity is an incredible problem in California. So instead of having to put more and more pressure on the Colorado River system, which South California depends upon for its drinking water, they're recycling. And that's been very successful, and other communities are starting to follow that lead.
Another phenomena has been the usage of agricultural produce for fuel, and that's disturbing because clearly resources are being shifted to maybe not the right areas from a global perspective. So in our efforts to cut down emission, we're actually increasing and exacerbating another problem. What has been your research, and what are your views on that?
Well, we did a big story on biofuels in the National Geographic that won an award back in 2007, 2008. And of course, originally we thought this was a great idea, right? We wanted to get ourselves off Middle Eastern oil, which was causing such political problems. And we thought, hey, we're the United States, we're the Saudi Arabia of corn. So we can make fuel out of corn. Europe decided to make a lot of diesel fuel out of oilseed crops. We thought this was a great way to reduce our emissions and reduce our dependency on foreign oil. Well, it turned out to be to bite us in the back, because right now we're currently using 40% of the U.S. corn crop for ethanol production, which is very inefficient, provides very little environmental benefit, is mostly a subsidy of the grain farmers in the United States. Of course, Europe is doing the same thing with oilseed rape, sunflower, and of course, you've seen the damage in your part of the world with oil palm and how it's led to deforestation in much of Malaysia and Indonesia. So these things have had an enormous environmental toll. Moreover, the projections, according to the United Nations and the World Bank, are for the land devoted to these crops to quadruple over the next 2 decades as people try to shift more and more into fuel, plant-based fuels. Now, this is, from a food perspective, this is absolute insanity. We're devoting so much of our land, 10% of the arable land in the United States, up to 15% in Europe, to developing these crops that we simply burn in our cars. Luckily, there are a lot more efficient biofuels that are trying to be developed. Algae biofuel, I mentioned in the book. Sugarcane, of course, is another one that's very efficient. So we can produce these ultra green fuels that do not compete with the food we need to produce for the planet. And hopefully soon our governments will recognize the idiocy of this whole grain-based biofuel movement and get rid of all the subsidies they've put in place to make it economically viable. Because without the subsidies, it would not, with the low oil prices today, it would not survive.
Whilst we are talking about food and how resources are being diverted away from food that would have landed up in somebody's plate, instead it's going into their car engine. What about the fact that on one hand, whilst we are dealing with possibly not being able to feed the billions that we will add in population over the next 20, 30 years, but what about the malnutrition that we are dealing with currently on today's terms? And at one hand, governments and organizations have to deal with fighting malnutrition, getting food on the plate, and also look at building future capabilities. So if people are malnutritioned, there is no way that you can do any kind of capability development going forward. So it becomes a vicious circle, right? So what is your thinking on that area?
Well, it does indeed. And of course, the FAO has come out and patted itself on the back that we now have 200 million fewer hungry people than we did during the food crisis of 2008. We now have about 800 million, which is still a phenomenal amount of people who don't get simply enough calories they need during the day to have an active and normal lifestyle. What they don't tell you, or what is kind of brushed aside, is that there are 2 billion people on the planet who suffer these micronutrient deficiencies that you just referred to. And this often leads to stunning, it leads to poor health, it leads to high infant mortality, high numbers of women dying in childbirth. It has an enormous impact, not just on our own well-being, but on the planet's economic output. I read a statistic today that said 2 to 3% of the world global economic output is lost from malnutrition alone. So if you look at the World Health Organization stats, it's still the largest primary underlying burden of global disease that we have, malnutrition and hunger, which in this age of plenty is a moral crisis. It's just absolutely abominable. I've heard in Nepal, the first sign that a woman is pregnant is that she comes into the doctor and she's anemic. So as soon as women get pregnant, they're immediately anemic because they have such low iron in their and vitamin A in their blood. This is an incredible problem. So we have to work on nutrients. It used to be all we had to do. The whole idea was that we just need to produce more. Yield was the key. And of course, now we're learning out that it's not just the quantity. We also need to improve the quality of the foods that we eat and make them more nutritious so that we can fill these nutrient gaps. And that's critical. And of course, that's one of the great challenges that we have ahead of us. Because as the climate gets hotter and we get higher CO2 in the atmosphere, the actual amount of protein in our staple foods declines. So again, it's this double whammy we're getting, which makes addressing climate change all the more important.
You've written about reducing meat consumption. So tell us a little bit more about that, and what are the statistics, and what's your reason behind that?
Sure. Well, that's one of the easiest things we can possibly do, and of course, this is very popular in India, where meat consumption is very low. Yeah. But also, India consumes a lot of dairy products, which have some of the same demands for grain and have some of the same emissions. But certainly, one of the easiest things the world can do, both for its own health and for the health of the planet, is to reduce its meat consumption. And again, we're talking mostly red meats, because that's the most inefficient meat to produce from an energy standpoint, from a grain standpoint. It takes 10 times the amount of grain to get the same amount of calories out of the same percentage of beef, especially grain-fed beef, as it does simply eating the grain alone. So it's incredibly grain and energy intensive, as well as water intensive. So, a half kilo of beef takes 1,000 or more liters, 1,800 liters to produce. So again, these things are very water and energy intensive. Now, many people have asked, well, why don't we just do like the Hindu and all become, vegetarian, which would be great. I would love if the world became vegetarian. It would probably be the easiest and quickest way we could solve much of the food problem. However, culturally, just from a diet perspective, it's very difficult for people who have been accustomed to eating meat to do. So what I've suggested is let's not, as a father of 3, it's hard for me to tell my kids, to cut them off and just eat spinach. So, but reducing the amount of meat, absolutely reducing or replacing that energy intensive beef and pork with much less intensive and more efficient fish, aquaculture fish particularly, I'm a big fan of. As well as poultry, which is incredibly efficient to produce, can both decrease our water use and our grain production as well. Now, I'm a huge fan of aquaculture. I think that's one of the big solutions. By expanding sustainable forms of aquaculture, we can produce an enormous amount of protein without using more arable land or without using much grain. So there are ways we can boost production without having much impact. And a lot of that, I'm afraid, is going to come from the sea. And it should come from the sea. It's very, it's an untapped resource for us.
So from what you're saying, Joel, clearly it is going to be a world which is hungry, thirsty, and crowded. And do you have any sort of words of wisdom as we bring this session almost to an end for our viewers?
Sure. Well, I do think there's a lot of hope. I am optimistic that we're going to figure this solution out. Every person who's suggested we're going to run out of food has been proven spectacularly wrong over the centuries, because we are incredibly adaptive. We are incredibly smart about how to do these things, and I think the next generation is certainly getting that lesson. So certainly by decreasing our meat consumption, increasing our aquaculture, closing some of the yield gaps with existing technology around the world. And my big thing, of course, is in terms of population. You know, India went through this thing where they had forced sterilizations. They tried to reduce their populations in drastic ways that were very unpopular. And what research has found since is that if we simply educate women to at least the 6th grade, so primary education, would love to have it through secondary education, make family planning services free and available to all, then they will voluntarily choose to have fewer children. So I always like to leave people with the idea, if we can kickstart this pink revolution by empowering women, young women around the world, then we may not need to produce another green revolution. You know, if we fill the unmet need for family planning services, population, according to the studies, could do exactly what we thought it would do 10 years ago, peak at 2050, and then start its slow and gradual decline to about where we are now by the end of the century, which would make it a whole lot easier for us to feed everybody sustainably and well without damaging the planet. So pink revolution is the key.
Wow, that's an interesting thought there, Joel. And with this, we'll bring this session to an end. Thank you so much for taking time out. I know it's an early morning back there in the United States, so thank you for taking time to do this session and speaking to viewers, which I think are pretty much from across the world right now.
Kumar, thank you. I've always a delight to speak with someone in India about these important issues, and I appreciate you giving me the time.